Sacha, why have you become known as the Human Swan?
A title which I resisted for some time, because basically my model for figuring out and getting lots of other people to help conservationists figure out what is going wrong for a Buick swan, I came up with this mad idea of flying with them on their migration, so from the Arctic Russia to the UK, and it had to be done in order for me to be able to tell the story of the birds to people and get them excited enough about the birds, to offer us kind of ideas and suggestions of what to do. I had to be able to tell the story kind of for them, and to do that, needed to fly in an aircraft that was, like the birds, exposed to the weather. I could take off and land pretty much anywhere without the need for runways and roads, because they're migrating across some of the wildest parts of the world. So yeah, I had to do it in this little paramotor. And for that, I became the Human Swan.
What was the catalyst?
So my expertise is in communicating conservation, and I often take a slightly alternative route. And I also try and apply the same sort of empathy that often conservationists have for the animals, and try and apply it also to the people. We often really miss that bit of, like, most people actually aren't bad. So anyway, I was in this room with lots of scientists from different countries who are all wanting to figure out and solve this bird from going extinct. And I just saw brilliant people, lots of brilliant data. And they were asking me to, like, how can we get the power companies and the hunters and other people that we've been trying to talk to for 30 years? How do we get them to a table? Can you help us write letters to meetings? And I just looked at it all and saying, like, all the people that you're talking to, they're just, the idea of, like, inviting people to meetings is not exciting. The story you're trying to tell them is a really miserable one. It's like, you're part of the problem and killing lots of birds, whether you mean to or not. It's not a story anyone really wants to hear. But there is a story there that I think everyone will want to hear. And I grew up in a hunting community. And so specifically thinking about them, I was like, they might not want to come to a meeting to be told they're bad, but they might want to hear about this incredible journey of these migrating birds. Most people don't imagine swans traveling from the Russian Arctic to the UK. If we can bring that story to life, then I think that will do it. And the big challenge, I suppose, was figuring out how to do it. And I thought of putting little cameras on birds, and that was never going to get approval certainly of a species that was in rapid decline. Eventually I just thought, flying in my paramotor, I fly at about the same speed and altitude as the swans. I suffer many of the same challenges as them, but it just looked ridiculous. A paramotor is not designed for flying.
Can you describe what a paramotor looks like?
So it is basically a big paraglider wing, lots of that you'll kind of attach yourself to. So you're hanging underneath that, and you have a propeller on your back, and you're hanging in a kind of a chair. So it's sort of soft fabric. So when you're on the ground, it's kind of tucked up behind you. But as soon as you run along and the wing is above your head and it starts to lift you, it kind of scoops the seat piece from the back underneath your bum. So you kind of get lifted off the ground once you've got, to make you airborne. Imagine swinging on a swing, but you're, a few hundred feet up, and you basically look down at your kind of feet dangling, and there's the world below you. So you can feel very, very fragile and exposed to the elements. The higher you get, it's actually the higher you are, the safer you are. Whatever goes wrong for the wing, obviously when you're falling, you've got a lot of time to try and figure it out. But you can quite easily feel very disconnected. And the higher up you go, the less you can notice movement on the ground. So you can also wonder whether you're actually making any progress. But it is a fantastic feeling, and I don't know why everyone doesn't do it.
You're both courageous and also a little bit bonkers, because I think very few of us would have the bravery to strap one of these things to our backs and put our lives on the line to bring awareness to this critical story, as you said. At any point did you think this is absolutely crazy, and how did you navigate that as those thoughts perhaps bubbled into your mind?
Right. So at the beginning I did, yes. So once I first had the idea of flying with them, I didn't tell anybody. In fact, I told a couple of people who I respected in the flying paramotor world. And one of them, before he knew what the idea was, had said, I want to come meet you. I'm really expert in logistics. He works in the RAF. Then he sat down, and he actually, when I told him what it was, he was like, I kind of deal in stuff that's possible. I thought, who is like, if there's anyone out there who would really think this was possible, who would it be? And it was, there was a guy called Richard Meredith Hardy. He was the first man to fly a paramotor across the English Channel. He'd also the first to get in a microlight and fly to South Africa. And I just thought, he's kind of quite mad, been in the expedition world a long time, does lots of ballooning. He's kind of on the edge of flying and exploration, but he knows everything. And he's definitely bonkers. And so I sent him an email, which was, I've had this idea. Everybody's telling me it's not possible, but if you break it down into lots of small chunks, which I've done, I can't see why any of them are impossible. It's difficult to get fuel in remote places, for example, but I can't see why it's impossible, despite everybody kind of dismissing it. And I got a message back from him, which just was, call me. And I was terrified. I thought, oh, he's either going to like just tell me off for being daft. Because I'd only been flying paramotors maybe for 2 years at that time. And I'd not done any long journeys at all. But I had, it was 2 years of developing my skills slowly. So I did call him, and he basically just quizzed me for half an hour. How would you do this? How would you do this? What's this like? What would you do here? Lots and lots of questions, and he laughed a lot, which definitely helped. And at the end he said, I think if anyone's going to do this, you are. You're right, it's not impossible. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. And next thing you know, so people like him are brilliant. He basically emailed me back with a list of useful contacts in every country, things that maybe I should think of, but almost worse than that is he'd copied all those people in. So by this time, there was my original email at the bottom, which had the plan of exactly what I was going to do. So by this time, the cat was out of the bag, kind of waited then for other people in the flying world, which is who he'd included. And there were people from the flying world in all the different countries. Once they started to respond with, yes, I'll help, or this would be a bit challenging to do this bit, but had other people going, this is not such a dumb idea and what an amazing cause. That was when you kind of like this confidence started to grow a bit. And then I realized actually none of the conservationists have heard of this idea yet. So I'd better go and email them. And then I just wrote up a page in the middle of the night, sent it off to the head swan researcher, and just thought, this is going to kill it in the water. They're going to say no. And they didn't. The response I got back was, this is totally bonkers, but we're so desperate and this might just work. Can we have coffee? And so I had coffee over 15 minutes, and they obviously didn't really know what paramotoring was. And I think that kind of helped. I could show them what it was. I was using it to do some aerial photography for work at the time. But yeah, in the course of the meeting, they were like, well, even if, I think perhaps one of the real things that I could say was, it's difficult and I don't know if it'll work, but I'm pretty sure just the idea of trying is kind of interesting enough. And we've already got people in the flying world offering to help. If this also works with other people along the flyway, that they're interested in getting involved and helping, then even if I don't manage to fly the whole route, it's already got people thinking about the migration of the birds and how can we contribute.
So you were less attached to that kind of end outcome and just the act of actually trying. And at what point did it?
The end outcome was a goal, not Sacha Dench flying the migration route. So I wasn't attached.
Right.
My ego wasn't tied in necessarily to the achieving it or not. It didn't really matter if Sacha Dench flying this route was a failure, as long as we had made progress towards getting all those audiences interested. I was then given £3,000, I think, to go up to Russia and figure out the bit that I thought was going to be the most challenging. It really wasn't in the end, but which was finding fuel drops up in the north where there's 1,000 kilometers of no roads and no runways. And that was where the idea was to start engaging with people in the hunting community, because they're the ones who are out using those regions when there are birds there. And so that was the start of it. And when I had a room full of men like laughing at me at first, they were all kind of like asking, but actually, who's the actual pilot? And I was saying, it's me. It's definitely me. There's no misinterpretation in the translation. It's definitely me. And then I kind of made a bit of an idiot of myself by showing them a map. And I was pointing to these towns, and they were all written in Russian. And I said, can I get fuel drops at these? Will I get fuel in these towns? And they were about 120 kilometers apart. And one of the men kind of put his hand up and he said, "Do you know what the word means in brackets at the end of the name of the town?" And I said, "No." He said, "That means abandoned." So you'd be lucky if there's much in the way of wood left, let alone a petrol station. But then there was just one man. He got up and he started making little marks on a map, and he was basically saying that he could leave fuel there. He does take hunting tourists out to those huts. He was basically the first one to stand up and say, "I think I'm happy to help you." And once one person had changed their mind, all the others were starting to go, "Oh, well, maybe I can do this as well." And then I was like, right, okay, so a key part is not only to figure out what stories are interesting, but who are the people, who are the potential influencer in their community in general. And that kind of works everywhere. And all it takes is that person to then start getting lots of other people to go, "Oh, maybe this mad woman is worth supporting." And
very powerful. Very, very powerful. That message exactly is identifying who those key kind of influencers are. But throughout this process, I think there is a lot of trust involved in your part as well, because you're saying, I'm going to have to fly 120 kilometers. I'm completely dependent on this one individual showing up and doing what they say they're going to. How is that for you?
I never questioned whether or not he would do it, to be honest.
Did you go to that kind of worst case scenario in your mind at any point?
Yeah. That is one nice thing about combining adventure with conservation. So I'm really comfortable with stuff going wrong because it's what happens on an adventure. The idea is that nothing is completely planned beforehand. So yeah, there were lots and lots of backups. So for example, when there was another pilot flying with me, we both had to have exactly the same, enough kit on us that if anything went wrong with your motor and you ended up somewhere remote, you could look after yourself for at least 3 or 4 days until we could definitely get some help out. But the idea was that if one person landed, there would be no expectation for the other person to also land, because it might be in a really unsafe place. It might have been a tiny bit of dry land in the middle of, a really huge bog, in which case there's no point putting 2 people at risk because you can't really help each other that much. So there was lots of backup thinking.
When was the greatest moment of doubt for you?
The greatest moment of doubt was having this mad idea in my head before starting and realizing and thinking just you can't even express this idea to people, and then having the first couple of paramotorists say it's not possible. And then, but not being able to let it go myself, I was like, but I just really think it is. And then I was like, either am I completely bonkers? Because it seems like it's out there, but I really, really think it could work. So there was definitely moments of part doubt, but this burning feeling that I just have to tell somebody.
To the point where it was keeping you up at night, I remember you saying.
I was just thinking, I'm just going to make an idiot of myself, but I had to do it. So anyway, there it was. And it became what it did. There were huge doubts around getting permissions to fly across the north of Russia. So I was basically asking to fly across 5 of their heavily guarded border regions in a small aircraft that doesn't show up on radar. I wasn't able to tell them exactly when I would take off and land, because in the paraglider, you are beholden to the weather. Anything more than 12 mile an hour wind, and it's very hard to take off and 100% be sure of not being dragged. And I was going to do it with cameras and on me and filming and potentially the kit to live broadcast. And I was going to stop in and talk to anybody that I felt like along the way. Nobody had flown, apart from just around a local city. No one had flown paramotors in these places. So yeah, they had plenty of really good reasons to say no. And for months, I wasn't getting any response from my applications for flying permissions. In the 2 or 3 months beforehand, when we were sitting with my fixer on the end of the Skype call and thinking, God, I've done everything I can. I've gone for influential people. We've got David Attenborough, we've got Ranulph Fiennes on the team. What else can we do? And my fixer said, he was great. He just said, Sacha, they're great people, but the Russians don't really know who they are. They really love James Bond. And I noticed that your last name is Dench. Yeah, we have always wondered whether Judi Dench was in the family, and then found a Canadian relative, did a bit of searching and found that it's tenuous, but my great-great-grandfather is her great-grandfather.
Wow.
Who was a customs officer from Weymouth. The unfortunate thing is that he was also a bigamist. So Judi Dench is from his first wife, and I'm from the second. The second who he married as well, whose name was Bessie from Battersea. And But I found myself writing this up in a letter and sending it to every address I could find online for Judi Dench and Judi Dench's contacts and Judi Dench's partner. And I got a response back that's kind of totally mad story, but I love the mission. And how can I possibly not be a patron?
Wow.
And with that, we did start getting a response. So I was still there a month beforehand. Before I was supposed to actually be flying. I went to Moscow, did as many meetings I could. So I went to departments and found the people who could write me a letter that would say, we support this mission. So it was the Minister for the Environment equivalent, and it was for natural resources. And so I had lots of letters, but still nothing from the aviation. So it was just a few weeks before I was supposed to set off when the governor for the region came down to a kind of a sort of launch party. And I was just thinking, I really did not have permissions to fly. Like, what the hell happens in Russia if you just set off flying through the middle of nowhere with no permissions? And you can be detained for a month or 2 months without any kind of justification. And so lots of people were telling me what you're thinking of doing is ridiculous. And I was like, I really don't think they are. They are still ordinary people, and they're going to be sold still on the mission. There is something much more powerful about the mission, if you can express that well enough. And found anyway, the governor came down and shook my hand, and at that point, and wished me luck. And at that point, I knew that this was going to be okay, because he is directly appointed by Putin, and there's no chance in the world he would come down and shake my hand and on camera if it wasn't known about. So at that point, I knew we could go for it. And then I got a message from the Russian FSB, what used to be called the KGB, which is something like, we can't give you permission, but we won't stop you. As long as I did have to send a text message before I flew and wait for a response. Yeah. This was via sat phone. And there was one area where I had to fly below 300 feet, which was not what you would normally safely do over a forest. But that was the only way we could get around it. And I now know that was all they were trying to do, was make sure that there was no chance I would collide with unmanned aircraft, because anyone flying an ordinary aircraft would see me, but their unmanned aircraft wouldn't. So they were just making sure that was never going to be a problem.
They were looking out for you.
Yeah. And you could hear it in the voices of air traffic control. There was like a bit of a smile behind the voice, people going, I can't believe she's doing this, but go you. And there was definitely a lot of kind of a Russian-British shared thing of or love, I suppose, of people with mad missions and adventurers. They've got long histories, both of them. How
long were you on this journey for, and how did people on the ground receive you when you landed in their villages and towns?
Well, there's a tiny bit of fear, but as soon as my helmet comes off and people can see that I'm female, that kind of goes. And the instant reaction is, who are you, but where have you come from, and do you need help? A lot of people assume if you've got a paraglider that you're actually a parachute and you've just fallen from an aircraft somewhere.
Wow.
But the reactions are fairly varied. There was one school in Rochester in Kent in the UK where the reception was the only place.
In the UK?
In the UK. It was really funny. I landed, we were trying to fly kind of along the Thames, and there was a massive storm was suddenly brewing, and actually we're trying to find a place to land was a bit difficult. There was a cleared area, which was an old field, which had clearly been used as a sports ground at some time. But as you went down, it had all sorts of junk in it. So people had burnt things and broken things. And I thought actually like metal bars and things sticking up from the ground, things had been buried. So it was too dangerous. So the next nearest thing was a school. And the school grounds were beautiful, like very well cared for, huge flat ground.
And they don't like you walking on the grass here, though.
It's a sports ground, and there were no children anywhere to be seen. So I was like, that's it. And I was on wheels at that point because I damaged my knee. So I was like, easy, right? So I came in and landed there, and man came out to me, as was quite often, and he was like, get off. And I took my helmet off, and it didn't subside. But the funny thing is that at the same time, we had been on London television the night beforehand, had lots of coverage for just having crossed the English Channel in the paramotor. It was a first. And because I'd been circling a bit in the area trying to find a place to land, there were people like scrabbling through the hedges of their place to try and get autographs. And even the ladies who'd been working with him, who were volunteering with him to help kind of maintain the grounds, they'd been there and they went up and they were like, oh, no, we saw this on television, it's legitimate. But there was no stopping. It was like, nope, get off. That's the only person in the whole of the journey who was like, get off, who are you? Worried about his very, very perfect grass. I mean, he did have very, very beautiful
priorities.
But generally people were really, really welcoming. So I had basic Russian, but there might have been somebody with me who could translate. So they'd be totally fascinated by kind of who and what and everything else. And eventually they kind of get to asking something like, so you really have come all the way here in that thing just to talk to us about swans. And then once they realize that you're willing to put yourself through that for a cause, they generally want to know, like, what can I do? And so that was just the perfect start to lots of conversations with different groups of people along the flyway.
Amazing. And how long were you up in the air for, or traveling for?
At any one time, I tried to not be in the air because it was cold. So the autumn migration from the Arctic to the UK actually was coldest over Estonia, but I tried to not fly for more than 2 hours. So even with heated gloves and everything, you start to get, as you get cold, your brain starts to get a little bit slower. So, and also from sort of sitting in the same kind of position for a lot of the time. Sometimes the flying is very energetic. If it's turbulent air, then you're moving your arms around a lot. There was an occasion where my batteries became unplugged. So the batteries that heat my gloves, just became unplugged, and it was too difficult for me to re-plug it in underneath I was wearing maybe 9 layers of clothing at that point. And within minutes, my hands were so cold. I was like, I just have to land. So I landed in a field. And by that time, I realized that it's really some stuff that's normally very simple, you have to really think about quite hard. So looking at a windsock, for example, like a windsock will tell you what direction the wind is, and you have to land into wind. And so that you normally do automatically when you're in a kind of good mental state. When you're really cold, that takes some effort. So yeah, all those things become much harder. And as soon as that becomes slightly hard, then I know that's when I've got to come down and have a break.
And what was it like seeing the world from that perspective, from the swan's perspective?
I think it's really healthy for everybody to just step back. It's just like kind of looking at issues, stepping back from issues and thinking like, is the importance kind of shouting about it here, or when you step back from the issue, are the blockages just these maybe two individuals thing? It's very similar, I find, for conservation, to be able to look at everything from above. So it gave me good headspace to think about the world. It also makes it really clear. So from above, people have thought, what information can you really get from following birds? Well, I know from the birds that have got satellite tags on them, we know which sites they're using. We also know exactly where they're using in a particular area. But if that's all you know from looking at the satellite tag, that's very different from actually being there and going, like, what is it about those particular sites that making they're going there? Are they going there because there's a threat in another part of the wetland, which is driving them there? Are they moving around because there's lots of disturbance? Is that because there's hunting, or is it just because, for some other reason? All of that sort of thing you can see from above. You can also see if there's sources of pollution. So after any kind of rain, you can see that very clearly in the changing watercolors. So you get a lot of information from looking at the world from above, and being there at the time is great to look at Google Earth and things, but that's one snapshot in time. And the other thing, it makes the world feel quite small, which is kind of scary, but it also means the problems sort of feel quite manageable. So when you've visited communities regularly, like every hour, every couple of hours, all the way, it makes us all feel quite similar. Yeah, we feel much more connected with lots of other people. And also, despite the language changes, seeing very similar level of human engagement and interest with a problem. If you can present it in the right way, people are people. They have very different levels of resources. Like some of them are doing a lot with very, very little, but people have still underlying a very, very similar desire to help. And if they see someone who's putting themselves out for a cause, it is a basic human action, I think, if you can present it in the right way to kind of go, well, How can I help?
I think so often the reason that we do shut down when it comes to challenges of environment, social justice, climate change is just because they are so emotionally zapping and provocative and overwhelming. And that is also because we've told a very singular narrative about these problems. And you only have to go into Twitter for 5 minutes to be completely inundated with catastrophizing kind of news stories. And so the fact that you're able to create an invitation for an opportunity to people and then embody that invitation by literally putting your life on the line to follow these swan migrations, you can see why people would just be in absolute awe. And I think really interesting, you spoke about this combination of the grassroots kind of engagement and how aware you were of just how similar we are and actually how little divides us. But then you also gained this really interesting kind of overview effect, which a number of astronauts have also articulated and expressed once they've gone, up and from the moon actually looked back at the planet. And just this aha moment of, oh my gosh, we are all one species. This is our home. We have to protect it at any cost.
I mean, that's definitely one of the really powerful things, and the reason that I kind of want to keep doing more flyways around the world, because it is a powerful narrative, and it's also inspiring for me. Like, I've also been in a space early in my conservation career where I was a scientist, but also trying to make change, and I did it in a very, very different way of just going, if people could just see it, then they would want to fix it. And I did it in quite a shouty fashion, I'd say that. And now I just keen to try a completely different approach to that.
And so how were you received when you came back to the UK?
I was so exhausted. So I did crossing the English Channel was it was a big deal for a lot of people, and it was a big stretch of water. When you're crossing a large body of water, the difficult position is you've got just a 2-stroke engine. If it fails, you are ending up in the water, whether you like it or not. And the water conditions and how your paramotor and the wing impact with the water, lots of different things could go wrong. If part of the frame sort of were to break, if it was hard, if you get dragged by the wing, there was so many variables. And I thought, God, what is the one thing that you really need? And I realized it's a bit of time. So, for example, I think apart from those bits of metal breaking, the paraglider, if it lands on you, the fabric kind of sticks to the water, then the lines can be tangled around you. There's so many variables. Also, if your body impacts the water, you can be winded. So even if you might take a breath. And I once broke a record in training for breath holding. So I knew that, I was really good for breath holding. But on impact, if you are winded, then you've got no air in your lungs. So then I realized, the key thing for me was flying with a spare air. So I just thought what you really need, if on impact with water, whatever kind of shock, you just need to have a couple of minutes to think about it. So knife, a spare air, and I think I was pretty good to go. So there was a little bit of concern from lots of people that this could be like the grand awful finale if your motor fails, and I was going to have to fly higher than ever before, because if you do get a motor failure, you need plenty of time to think about, prepare, get yourself untangled from everything. So I was at 3,500 feet, and it was pretty freezing up there as well. So some kit doesn't like being in the cold, so you can get kit failures. Lots of things are potentially challenging. Anyway, once I had that sorted, went up to 3,500 feet, had a beautiful flight across the English Channel. And I landed, and to the kind of media asking, how does it feel to be the first woman to cross the English Channel in a paramotor? And my gut reaction was, I have just flown 6,500 kilometers from Arctic Russia. Aren't you more interested in that? But I think I'd managed to say something a bit more inspiring, because it was, it was a big deal. It was a first. And for the main reason that the media had been so amazing to us from the whole journey. There's often a sort of narrative about, distrust of media, which is so rampant. And one of the approaches I'd taken right at the beginning was to really sit down and explain to any journalist that looked like they were likely to be on board, like interested for more than just one piece. I'd bothered to talk to them about the expedition, but not only the expedition and how it would work, but also how we're hoping that the media coverage will actually directly help the conservation of swans. And I've worked with the media for a long time, and so I kind of know how to press like the simple buttons. How do you get headlines and things? But it's a bit of a different thing when you can say to people, actually, it's great to have this coverage, but I'm not that interested in like coverage of Sacha Dench. But if you can get coverage of this, or actually make sure you say where our camp is, then people will come down, and we want local people to come down and find us and tell a story. That was such a powerful tool to have local people hear about in the news and come down and say, well, I've heard this is happening, and how about this and this power line here? Some people bought footage of birds that colliding with power lines because they were like, well, I heard about it and this happens every day near us. So the media had been incredibly helpful. I think we'd had 1,800 pieces of coverage by that time in all the different countries, 84 in Russia, where people said the Russians will never cover conservation. It's just, they will.
If you're courageous enough.
At that point, I suppose it was a fantastic finale in a lot of ways.
Amazing. And how has it affected swan conservation since?
So one of the target areas was the shooting of swans up in the Arctic, and trying to figure out where it's happening, what are the reasons, how can we stop it. We just didn't have the engagement with hunters. So we now have a group of 20 who are called the Swan Champion Network. It includes all the Russian tourism operators up in the town of Narya, where I came from. It includes some people from Arkhangelsk as well, which is another major city where largely the foreign tourist hunters are coming from. And we had plenty of conversations with people going, we just didn't know. Like, lots of Westerners hate the idea of hunting anyway. So it was hard to figure out whether, when you first mentioned swans, was this just because swans are in fairy tales? Is it because they're really declining? But we really just didn't know. And when you think about it, they're from a part of the world where there is no agriculture, that's permafrost. So they rely on, in the past anyway, people, the local nomads have relied on hunting and berries and mushrooms and things for food. So they have a very different interaction with animals, which is part of their culture. They're happy to eat reindeer, follow them, have them as pets, revere them. Like, reindeer are everything in their world, but they don't have a problem with also eating them. And so I've been invited up once or twice a year in the last couple of years to go and help show the film. We've got a film showing, going up, traveling all around different communities. The last census of swans is showing the swan population not only levelling off but starting to increase again. Wow. The real test will be on illegal shooting, is when we next do scanning, catching birds and scanning them. Will the young birds have the same rate of lead pellets in their bodies? But it's not just Russia. One of the nice things about the expedition that we found in lots of other places, there are issues of illegal shooting of Buick swans. There were 2 shot in Belgium week before last. But the inspiring thing about that is that 3 separate people got in touch on Facebook and said, this is an issue. Here are the pictures. These are people that you could speak to. There are other people out there who are interested and who will want to know this. So that's fantastic. An app has been created so that any member of the public can, if they are seeing birds hitting power lines regularly, can basically mark it through the app. You don't have to have a picture of the dead bird, and that will all be taken into by the IUCN. So the next stage for me is to promote that as widely as possible, particularly on main areas of the flyway. So we've done a really good job towards tackling the illegal shooting, the power line collisions, and plenty of other stuff in different parts of the world. In areas where the wetlands have been turned into fish farms, it seems it's a reasonably common thing. Going through those areas and realizing that actually these sites are quite important. They might not be the areas where they winter or where they breed, but this is the last place they can stop and feed before they do the few thousand kilometers all the way back to where they have to breed. And the condition that they land there will determine whether or not they've got enough energy to actually breed. There is farmland they can feed on, but there isn't their roosting sites anymore because this is now a fish farm. And so we had fish farm owners saying, well, we don't have to drain the ponds at this time of year. For those times they're migration, we can keep the water levels higher and drain them 3 weeks later. That's not a problem. And so we've now got areas where there are roosting sites available for migrating birds. And it's not just the Buick swan, it shares the migration route with lots of other birds migrating between Western Europe and Russia. So lots by putting out an incredible story and an open call for people to be a part of it, giving them an opportunity to be one of the good guys, not the bad guy, which is what we tried to do the whole way.
Absolutely. As we stand looking in the face of the sixth mass extinction and the decline of species in every corner of the world, why do you feel like we've become largely complacent as a society with the demise of other species on this planet? And what do you think is keeping more people from stepping up with the kind of courage and tenacity and uncompromising resolve that you held to be able to pursue this really ballsy flight and journey?
We are generally less connected with stuff that is going on around us with the natural world, living largely in cities. There's also, I think, a feeling just of general overwhelm. The world just feels so big, and most people don't feel like anything that they could actually do. I mean, people are comfortable with like quick stuff on social media, or sharing something, a like on something, because that's kind of an easy, quick thing to get over the whatever issue you're kind of upset about at the time. But just having no idea what they can do and how on earth their tiny thing could help. And this belief that it's, the government or somebody else is actually the one who needs to fix it. And there are definitely things that they can all do. But the thing that really made people go, well, I can do something, was hearing stories of other people along the flyway who've also not got very much, who've also got like zero power, saying, well, I could do that bit. And so being able to think, oh, well, if I do this bit here, and somebody else does that bit, then overall I can see that might add up to something bigger. But it kind of needed us to come along and say, here's this issue, like let's focus on this one for a time. If you help this, other things will also benefit. But it's not you on your own. It's you and that person. It's the Net's community, making sure that none of the kids who start shooting for their families at 9 years old, make sure that they know that the Buick Swan is in decline, and at least until the populations are back at high levels, let's just give them a break. If people are doing a small thing up in a place like Russia, then someone in Devon has said to me, well, if they can do that bit, then I can leave my whatever hedges longer. I can do this stuff. So the connection between different people seeing that other people will also help, and this can add up to something really significant. And maybe it helps also that we are going to measure it. So we will be looking at, we will be catching birds, we will be scanning it.
It's the bravery of a single individual stepping up. And then it is that sense of the collective, isn't it? Because I think often when we're looking in the face of a messy problem, as you said, we try to spread ourselves thin by lots of kind of micro actions, and it is retweeting, it is sharing the petition and whatnot. And that kind of sways us in the sweet assurance that we've done our bit for a time. And yet the problem continues to mount and the guilt continues to mount in the face of it. I
basically got to the point when I was sitting on my idea, I just saw something, I thought, I really, really think this will work. I did sit on it for a long time, and it's possible that I could have just sat on it if I hadn't found, say, Richard Meredith Hardy. He just said, actually hearing you, I think you really can do it. So he was the first person that really backed me up when he didn't have to, because I had an idea and I actually just threw it out there. I suffered people going, oh, this is ridiculous, and realized even if they say it's ridiculous, we might end up coming up with a better idea. So just try and get over that first hurdle of having an idea and throw it out there, see whether what sort of feedback you get. And even the really negative stuff, they're good devil's advocates, those kind of negative comments, and they
flag things perhaps before you are able to see them.
Flag things and help you test your resolve as well. So if you go, you don't know what you're talking about, then if you're dead certain of that, then that's a good thing. So that will help build the confidence. But those people are made by the small group of people that in the early days say, we'll back you. And so being one of those people is also really, really important. You need more of those than you need the kind of the hero figure potentially. But if there's somebody there who's got an idea, please be the person that you think is good. Please be the person that steps up and backs them, because that really makes a massive difference. And so we got to the point right before leaving on the expedition, I just thought, what if this just does not work? What if there's a reason why nobody has ever flown? And I managed to get in the air, and I just can't do it if the air really is too wet. I was at that point then where there were so many people who'd stepped up to help that I felt like a stage diver. I was just going to launch, and pretty much no matter what happened, there would be somebody would step up and and fill the gap and help it to work. And that, I suppose, I'm going to carry with me into future projects where there are big ideas, and just sharing it with enough people who buy into it, who then will step in and help.
And exactly as you said, you realized from point blank that this wasn't the Sacha Dench show. It was about something so much bigger. And in fact, I think that is really the power of having that kind of mandate, that mission that isn't about you, because you're able to circumnavigate, the armchair critics, but also the internal demons that are telling you it's not possible, it's too hard. It's like, well, actually, I don't have a choice in the matter.
Yeah.
I kind of have to do this no matter what. And where do you think, at what point in your life do you feel that kind of conviction was ignited?
At 11, I entered a public speaking competition in Australia, at which I was giving a talk about apartheid, an anti-apartheid talk. And I wasn't even it wasn't in South Africa, but
at 11 years old. Wow.
At 11 years old, yeah. We did have issues in Australia, and one of my best friends was Aboriginal, and there were issues from both sides where it had been a bit difficult. So I guess maybe it was triggered then. That was this public speaking competition. There was me talking about apartheid as an 11-year-old. I have no idea anymore what I said or why I was so sure that I was enough of an expert on the issue. But I was speaking against others who were talking about ghosts and tourism in my town. And people tried to convince me that I should go for something that was more suitable for an 11-year-old. And I just was like, no, this is what I think is important to talk about. So clearly that's been there from a young age. Why? I am not sure. And where did it start being conservation? Well, I grew up in the Australian bush and was just very interested in nature. I'd spent a lot of time kind of watching it. And it was just, for me, like this endless space of curiosity and wonder, from like the big scale stuff to the tiny stuff. It just was fascinating to me, the natural world. So it started off as being an intrigue, rather than feeling like I needed to save it specifically. But the town I grew in was also in the middle of quite a few issues. Well, it was the capital of whaling in Australia. So there was those issues that it had in its past. The fishing industry was busy going through quite rapid change. Obviously, fish stocks were disappearing quite quickly, but it's also a centre for logging. So most of the logging was run by a Japanese company, but most of the local people were employed, and there were plenty of people also tying themselves to trees and trying to campaign against it. So it was in the middle of those kinds of complex issues with really good friends and good people on both sides and every front. So it kind of gave me a perspective on people and issues and conflict that was interesting enough that it's meant that now I can kind of draw on that experience and apply it to other issues. Birds specifically are not what I'm passionate about. No particular species, I would say. I'm interested in kind of big picture solution change, big picture change in people, and finding things that I personally think that I can benefit. And if it's a species that will help lots of other species in doing so, then that's what I'll do.
I see this pattern reflected in my own upbringing, growing up in the Australian bush, and the deep appreciation for the natural world that kindled in me, especially because there were no boundaries. Nature was not an other in my context. We lived in a living room with, I think, 3 walls, which meant that, there was a day when under every pillow on the couch, Mum found a baby python curled up and sleeping peacefully. And something I still do out of habit is check my boots before I put them on in case there's a green tree frog or a little spider hiding inside in wait for me. And so I think that also created the fabric of my deep appreciation for the lived experience of so many species. Equally, the town I grew up in Queensland, our family was, lobbying against the frackers who were trying to come in. And we were hearing the harrowing stories of the town next door where, kids were waking up with asthma that they had never had before and nosebleeds as a direct consequence of this fracking and this mining. And, seeing what was happening to the Great Barrier Reef. It's that combination of that kind of ecophilia, that deep awe and love for the natural world, and then experiencing that loss. And I feel that very much with you as a fellow Australian, to see what is happening to our country right now And I know you, more than anyone I know, have been personally affected by the fires in a way that few of us can appreciate.
We did lose our family home despite pumping 120,000 litres and planning to try and defend it. We just realised that this fire was just way too big. And so, our place is a pile of ash now, which, to be honest, we're still kind of coming to terms with. It's very easy to just forget that you don't have a house there anymore. So it's been pretty traumatic, but looking as you have to at what is the potential positive from it. It has given me a pretty extreme conviction, but also moments of inspiration. So I would never imagine that in our town, the conversation at the pub would be about climate change. It's given the world a very, very clear, vivid picture of what changing climate will mean in some places. It's taken it out of the kind of conceptual Twitter chats and stuff. It's just made it very visual for a very long time. So I'm hoping that it will be the snowball that we can get rolling. And if losing our house can give me the conviction, hopefully that the whole story will give a lot more people the same conviction to go out. And if you've got an idea or you can see the way that something can be fixed, just go out and do it, because now's the time when people are going to back you.
I think it's incredible that in such a moment of grief and loss, you were able to gain that kind of perspective. And I think the fear of many people in this space is that as we continue to experience this crisis and this catastrophe, that people are just going to disengage altogether. But as you said, Australia is showing the world what our reality is going to become in the context of the climate crisis. And it also shows how it can rally people together. I mean, I have never felt such a sense of patriotism as I have when I've heard the stories of small towns coming together and rebuilding and supporting one another. And exactly as you said, having these conversations about climate change, which just wasn't in the vocabulary, 2 years ago.
No. And people, even with strong convictions, would have probably struggled to actually mention it because people are going to turn away, and just that's changed.
I think as we consider this idea of home and what home means, I feel that we need to instill a greater sense of collective community. And I think that is the power of something like the climate crisis, is that it really brings things into perspective. It gives us that macro overview. Because, just as Australia is in flames, my second home of Indonesia has just experienced some of its worst flooding in Jakarta, over 100,000 people displaced, dozens of people who have passed away. And we're just going to continue to see this catastrophe unfolding in every which corner. And with that, we need to recognize that every decision that I make in my daily life has a ripple effect somewhere else in the world. And that is the nature of living in very globalized kind of times. The fruit that I buy in the supermarket comes from a different country. The clothes that I'm wearing were fabricated in a different country. With that comes incredible potential and power as well, if we are able to appreciate just how much we are all in this together. This isn't community against community. It isn't nation against nation. Climate change does not discriminate, nor does the ecological crisis. And so we're looking at our collective future. And this is not something about future generations. We recognize that it is something experiencing us right here and right now. How do you think we can better support people to recognize that collective humanity and that collective community? Because part of my fear is that if we do not have that social fabric, people are potentially going to turn against one another if they're already starting from such a low point. you often hear it, how can I care about the end of the world if I'm already caring about the end of the week, and looking after myself.
Yeah. The nice thing for me, I suppose, was seeing people who are just going to communities where people are really thinking about how they're eating now and tomorrow, and still having them say, well, still look at what actually they physically can do. So there is quite a big willingness. I suppose there are people living in communities where climate change is very visual. Like, so they gave me rotten meat at one point and said, well, it wouldn't normally be rotten, but the permafrost doesn't come as high anymore. So we can't bury where we bury kind of the meat is not cold enough. So there's people who are like experiencing climate change constantly, but just going, we're just going to have to adapt with it, and still going like, how can we help you with the swan thing as well? You said climate change affects us all, but it's kind of all of us, but some people suffer right now much more than anybody else. So my next expedition has taken me across areas of the Sahara. The Sahara is also expanding quite quickly. So I'll be again going to places where a changing climate is affecting people right now. So my next trip is Scotland all the way to Ghana in West Africa. And there we'll be showing people not only the connection, I suppose, between everybody, but also that those kind of other people, those people in Africa that seem very, very different to people in England, actually they really aren't that different at all. But because we take people on a journey all the way, we'll really try and show the connections. And also, they'll try and talk about what are the repercussions for some of the climate issues that maybe will affect you. So the desertification in Africa doesn't feel like it affects you. But when you think about that's also where lots of our vegetables are coming from. And if their areas are becoming uninhabitable, people will be looking for other places to live. So we'll have to be moving. And they're not bad people. They're just people trying to live on this planet. What is going on in Africa isn't another world. That's actually that's kind of your extended vegetable garden. That's where your mobile phone bits and pieces come from. This is where the oils that are in your shampoo and all your products, like most of Unilever's oils, are largely coming from there as well. So in so many different ways, we are impacting, and it is something that we really are all in together. And I feel that's what maybe the thing that you and I both have, which is very hard to get through to people if they haven't had it, is the growing up where nature was part of your world and you were a part of nature. So very, very similarly, we built our house over time and it was completely surrounded by trees and the snakes would come in and out. We raised a couple of wombats and a couple of wallabies when they were orphaned and brought to us. There was no difference, and I was allowed to go out and spend 2 or 3 days camping with friends, just finding where we'd go in the river, building huts and shelters, and then coming home again, following animal tracks because it's much easier to get through the bush that way. Nature has always felt like just part of me and part of life. It's very hard to give people that if they haven't had it as a child. And maybe that's one of the things that I also try and do with this expedition, if you can try and see stuff from the eyes of animals.
And there's something really, really powerful that you said about moral convictions as well. And I think it draws back to this critical age of 11 and you stepping up and saying, I want to give a speech on this subject that I'm really passionate about. Because I see that trend in friends, I see it through our research. It's this really critical kind of inflection point. For me, it was when I first started watching documentaries and made this very kind of grandiose vow that I wanted to be a voice for the voiceless and that I wanted to commit the rest of my life to doing this thing. That was at 11. For our mutual friend, John Elkington, it was when he made his first donation to WWF and rallied all of his schoolmates around and said, there's this conservation charity and I think we should put our pocket money together and support them. And I see that in so many of the 11 and 12-year-olds that I work with in schools as well. And it's this magical combination of sort of a naive optimism, but also this kind of black and white view of ethics and something being right and something being wrong. And they haven't been around long enough for a society to clip the wings of those imaginations. And so they just stand up and they say, I don't want to do this because I don't think it's right. And it grates on something inside of me. And I think part of the challenge that I've experienced trying to communicate to, politicians, business folk, is that their values have been so plastered over by the nature of showing up to a job that they have no love for, because they're jaded by the bureaucratic systems in which they're having to operate, that they're so out of touch with that younger version of themselves that had total clarity of what matters and what we should be fighting for. And so
how do you make all of them, take them all back to that 11-year-old?
I think a lot of it is kind of stripping away the narratives that we subscribe to as we operate in our 9 to 5. I think we're all in some sense beholden to one narrative of capitalism and the commodification of nature, the commodification of people. It's a real contrast that you see in many of the indigenous people I've worked with. The value of the tree is not seen for the table. It's seen for its inherent worth. It's seen for its ecological and ecosystem services. And so it is that kind of shifting of values, and it's that decommodification. And there is ability, I believe, to unhook from those kind of stories. But it is very difficult when we're living in environments that on the one hand are super urban, as you highlighted, are disconnected from the natural world, but also once we're constantly plugged into social media, which has been constructed to perpetuate consumerism, have us wanting more all the time and be constantly switched on. And we're also told through the education systems that we grow up in that we have to go and pursue 9 to 5 jobs that might not, provide us any sense of real self-worth or value or giving back or contribution, but at least we're able to pay our bills at the end of the day and pay off the mortgage. So I feel that part of it is gaining perspective. And I do feel that times of crisis are what can cut through in a much more rapid way many of those stories that we construct about the world that we live in.
Yeah.
Whether you can orchestrate that without the crises, I think it's harder the older you get.
I'm interested to know what you think about the difference between the way we need to actually do this, but feeling like actually I'm going to be the only one, or this is not going to be popular, or it won't happen, or it won't be successful.
Well, I think that can be the beauty of reinstating those kind of intrinsic values that emanate from within about contribution and connection and community over the extrinsic values of consumption and status and wealth and comparison. Because then I feel a lot of those stories that we tell ourselves that limit our own potential kind of fall away, because exactly as you illustrate, Sacha, it's not about you. It's not about any one of us. And there is no other alternative, right? It's like, actually, no, this is the fate of an entire species that has been evolving for millions of years, or it is this precious part of land that I really care about, or it is this community in this corner of the world that is going under. And that, I think, having that why is what can create that perspective. Someone
I know paid for me to go and see a coach, or executive coach, I think they were called. Underneath it all, I was saying, I've got all these kind of great ideas, things I'd like to change, but the overarching narrative was nobody would ever let me do it. I can't do this. People don't agree to this. Like, I can have this vision of where I think things should go, but there's just lots of blocks and it's everybody else. So this person just said to me in frustration, just spend 2 weeks wandering around. You're going to resign from what you're doing anyway, so what have you got to lose? Just spend the next 2 weeks and wander around, and every day remind yourself that whatever you suggest, people are going to say yes to. Just assume everyone's going to say yes, and just say them all. Like, who cares? You've got nothing to lose. And so I did it, and I wandered around, and there was just like doors opening everywhere. And I was like, wow. And I wonder if that is of use to anybody else, to just try it. If you're to the point of thinking, this having a moral conviction that I think things should be different, but nobody else is going to let me do this, maybe just try assuming that you are completely wrong and they just might.
That is the power of assumptions, isn't it? And even if you go into the assumption with, everyone's going to say yes and one person does turn around and say no, because you're attached to that positive kind of mindset, it doesn't make it about you. You don't take it personally. You're like, okay, that person's projecting whatever they need to project at this point in time.
It's just such a release to be able to just make it really not about you, it's about what you're trying to achieve, then it's you become much braver. And you started this off by saying I was very brave, and I was like, wow, as a kid, would I really thought that I was really brave? Probably not, but I've become brave on certain issues that I have a really strong conviction of. Before Flight of the Swans, my dad called me up and said, I'm reading what they're saying in the media about, flying in areas nobody's flown and bad conditions, blah, blah, blah. How dangerous is it really? And I basically said to him, I've done every bit of preparation I can do for this trip. I've looked at all the potential risks that I can imagine, because we don't know what they all are, because nobody's done this before, and I've tried to dealt with them. But just for you to know, I have had an incredible life, and I'm actually at a point, I'm so convinced this will work that I'm willing to try it. And if that means that I have a horrible accident on the way, I believe in this enough that I'm prepared to take that risk. And my dad just said, I can't really argue with that.
Wow.
And then it was like everything else was okay, so I could just go for it.
Pretty incredible what we can achieve when we are willing to look in the face of our own mortality and in the face of death and think about that legacy piece. My dad is a frustrated poet, and so he often sends me quite lengthy WhatsApps. And in a recent one, he said to me, he was reflecting and saying that I think many of the world's problems and why we're so disconnected is because we're carving our names so deeply in the tree of life that we look as if we're about to kill it. And that comes from fear of our own mortality. And I do get this sense that when you have that mandate, almost that message from God, all of the superficial stuff falls away, because you get this really kind of cosmic perspective, which is like, actually, is life about getting those 1 million followers? Is it about getting that job promotion? Or is it about giving myself over in service of something?
Yeah.
And living every day from that place of contribution. And it is finding that sweet spot in the messy middle, isn't it? It's that junction between passion and pain. Pain being that problem that you have every conviction to want to solve, and passion being where you're kind of in that sandpit and what draws your curiosity and where you just naturally like to play. And I think that's it, as well as sustainability on the macro level has been so enshrouded in this message of kind of sacrifice and changing people's behavior and limiting what we can and can't do. And in fact, we need to really invite a new story, a new narrative in around why this is an invitation, why this is an opportunity for us to reconnect, to be happy. The mental health crisis that we're now seeing is the worst it has ever been. And much of that stems not just from the scale of the problems, but of inaction from people in elected positions of power. Young people are looking up at big business and politicians and saying, you're not acting with the urgency that this challenge requires. Then what we need to do is not project our responsibility, as you said, onto many of those institutions that by their very fabrication nature cannot create the change that is required, but look to our own individual initiative and not just our responsibility, but our role. Responsibility because we have won the lottery of life on this planet. I think we tend to over-fixate on the mini lotteries that we lose, right? But focus on that macro picture of just the opportunity that you've been gifted with. And then recognize, as you said, by playing in that messy middle of passion and pain, what your role is. If the world is a 7.6 billion piece puzzle in which everyone has a place, what does that little cutout look like for you? And as you did as well, kind of relinquish expectation. It was the very nature of taking that first step. And as you said, reconciling, okay, I might fail in this kind of grander mission, but it's the fact that I tried. It's the fact that I did something big and bold and courageous. And so what comes next for you, Sacha?
Based on the last trip, I have been offered this, or given this title of UN Ambassador for Migratory Species, which takes me out from my sort of focus on on species and individual flyway routes to actually looking at what impact I can have globally for migratory species. They do have particular challenges in that most of the countries that they're on their route don't have them in their national plans for a species, and some of them are very hard. I mean, conserving tuna populations that are highly migratory and invisible to most people. What do you really do for that? So my next phase is probably figuring out how does my particular set of skills fit globally? Where can I best put my effort? And again, it feels, at the moment, I'm a stage of feeling like I could be slightly overwhelmed by it, because I'm really not interested in titles with no meaning. I mean, it's nice. It might open a few more doors to meetings, but I'm interested if I can use it to make an impact. So I'll be looking at that on a bigger level. And I'm also looking at a couple of species that are potentially seen as the opposite for the beautiful swans, is that one of the global migratory groups of birds which are struggling most are the vultures. So how can I try and make people care for the vultures? So the crisis is so bad that there was a conference of migratory or birds of prey where every single researcher said, let's just forget my species and just focus on the vulture.
Wow.
And in some of the populations have lost 99% of them. In many ecosystems, they're like the sewage treatment works for a city, for example. Nobody really wants to talk about the sewage treatment works, but if it wasn't there, we'd all be really, really upset about it. So in some places, they literally are the sewage treatment system. They are a weird bird that can get enough protein out of human feces that they can actually live on it. I mean, it just sounds dreadful, but in some areas, that is that is a linchpin. So hence why I've been asked, how can I help to try and bring that back? Unfortunately, when there's a carcass on the ground after an incident of poaching, the animal is killed, the vultures will be there in no time, circling above, ready to do what they do best, which means they're also becoming a marker for where there's poaching going on. So poachers are realizing if they poison all the vultures, then they don't have that problem anymore. And you can see why on so many levels that is a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. There's also a really, really unfortunate consequence of a veterinary drug used for cattle and actually used in humans for gout that took many years to figure out that was the one thing that a vulture only needs a tiny amount of that left in a carcass and every single vulture will die. Wow. So that's wiped out most of the population in India, for example. The reality for a global ecosystem to thrive again, we need to go back to rewilding. Things need to be allowed to die in nature, and the things that eat dead things need to be allowed to eat them. So if we are going to let animals die and decay and be eaten, then that will cause a whole nother problem. So there's lots of different issues around the world, but vultures are not beautiful. So what role can I play in solving those issues using what I do best?
And as you communicate to a range of different audiences, what are some of the tools that you use as someone who has a real gift for analogy and storytelling? And how do you try and persuade some of the people who are really kind of calcified and don't want to hear it?
The first thing is using the empathy for other species with the person. So really trying to initially figure out who they are and what drives them. So just normal chat. I mean, I try and understand the other person as much as possible. Also looking at the situation, what could be their kind of pain? What are their fears? What are their kind of hopes? And trying to figure out how on earth, where is the common ground between us? And then when it comes to storytelling, and the important also, I suppose, convincing people to want to be a part of change, offering them a chance to be one of the good guys, not the bad guys from the offset. Because as soon as you create that kind of wall of you're the other and you get their defenses up, then it's very, very hard to get back from that. As soon as you trigger that kind of fight or flight, you've got that all that process going on in their brains. And in that sort of state, people are looking at, pure defense mechanism. They're not open-minded at all. Whereas if you can inspire in people, as I do generally through story, whether it's mine or whether it's stories of others, if you can trigger a sense of awe in people, then you are opening their creative space. So you open them up to an idea of creativity, but also you open up the sense of feeling quite small in the world, but also very connected to others. So that is where I try and get people before we start talking about an issue. It's triggering awe and wonder and creativity, and then going, and this is the problem that we have.
Yeah.
Like, what ideas have you got?
And so with that, as you reflect on your own legacy, you're still here. You made it.
Plan to be for a long time, and who knows? Yeah.
You made it, Sacha. What do you want to be remembered for?
I'd like to think that I have taken the weird collection of skills and passions that make me me, and have used them for the most good in the world. And that's what I hope other people can do. I mean, I would never say anybody else should fly paramotors with migrating birds, because there were definitely moments on the expedition where I was thinking, most people in the world would think this is awful. What I'm doing is absolute hell. And I just kept saying, but I'm in my element. Like, I just feel like this is me. This is me being the best of who I can and having an impact where I think I can. And that's, I suppose, the message that I'd like to get across to people.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Sacha. That was absolutely incredible.